My name is Rachel Davis. I am 48 years old. At my sister's house in Austin, Texas, on Christmas Day last year, my brother-in-law told the table that I was basically middle management. He said it the way people say things they have already decided are true, with the easy confidence of a man who has never been wrong about anything he could measure. He was talking about a year in which I had coordinated intelligence support for 3 classified direct action missions that I cannot describe to you in any detail whatsoever. I smiled and passed the gravy. I said, something like that. And that was the right answer, because there is no other answer. When you are sitting at a table set for 14 people, and the man at the head of it has spent the entire evening explaining the world using language he learned at a leadership conference. But there was someone else at that table, a man named Martin Haley. He had spent 31 years in national security law, and he had read documents that Greg will never be cleared to see in his lifetime. He put down his fork when Greg said it. He put it down with the specific deliberateness of a person who wants their hands free before they speak. And then he said something quiet. It took approximately 10 seconds. I've been carrying those 10 seconds since December. And I think it is time to tell someone what it felt like to be seen after 13 years of being invisible in a room full of people who said they loved me. Let me go back. I was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is not a coincidence. My father was career Army, 30 years, infantry, the kind of man who pressed his uniform the night before and never explained himself to anyone because he did not believe explanations were necessary when the work spoke clearly. My mother worked simultaneously as a bookkeeper for 3 separate small businesses and ran our household with a precision that I only understood was remarkable once I left it. I grew up in a house where work was something you did completely, without complaint, and where the results did not require narration. You either did the thing or you did not. The thing either held or it did not. That was the whole framework. I joined the Army when I was 22 years old, a spring commissioning after 4 years at the University of Georgia, studying political science with a minor in a language I will not name here, because naming it narrows the geography of my career more than I am comfortable with in this context. I went in as an officer. I was assigned to military intelligence because I was good at the specific kind of thinking it requires. The holding of contradictions until they resolve, the reading of incomplete pictures for the shape of the thing that is not visible, the willingness to sit with uncertainty and produce something usable from it anyway. Someone who watched me in training said I was too good at the quiet parts of the job to waste on the loud ones. In that world, that is a compliment. I took it as one. The first 8 years of my career followed the standard shape of the profession. I moved between assignments, accumulated analytical skills and operational exposure, deployed to places that showed up in the news and to places that did not, and built a record that was clean and steady and unremarkable in the precise ways that matter in intelligence work. Unremarkable, in my profession, means no surprises, no security incidents, no lapses in discretion, no problems of any kind that arrive sideways and require someone above you to spend political capital solving them. I was promoted at the rate you are promoted when you work competently, maintain your relationships carefully, and understand that in classified environments, the loudest person in the room is almost never the most important one. Around year 9, something shifted. I was given an attachment that I will describe in the broadest terms available to me. There are organizations within the United States military that have publicly known names and publicly available descriptions of their general mission. There are organizations within the United States military whose names cannot be confirmed or denied in any open context, regardless of the information already visible in public reporting, because confirmation carries its own classification consequence. My work, beginning in year 9 of my career, touched both kinds. The second kind was where I spent the majority of the decade that followed. The specific nature of what I did in support of those organizations is not something I will ever describe to anyone who does not hold the appropriate clearances, including my sister, including the man I dated for 4 years who told me once that the mystery had felt romantic until the weight of it started costing him sleep. I understood. I could not fix it. The work was the work. What I can tell you is what kind of work it was not. It was not paperwork in the conventional sense. It was not analysis conducted from a comfortable desk in a building with good lighting and a normal commute. It did not operate on civilian notions of what a workday is, what a work week looks like, or what constitutes a reasonable boundary between professional obligation and personal life. The work traveled. The work kept hours that are not described accurately by the word irregular. The work had consequences in a category that I will define only by saying that I have been in rooms where those consequences were reported, and in those rooms, on specific evenings that I count privately, I was told that something I had provided had been the piece that made something else possible. I was not always told what the other thing was. I was told that it mattered. That had to be enough. For 26 years, it was enough. My left shoulder was injured in the third year of this particular assignment during a set of circumstances I will not specify. The injury was repaired surgically at a facility I will not name by a surgeon whose skill I have no complaints about. The repair was competent. It was not complete in the way that repairs are sometimes not complete when the original damage was of a particular kind. In cold weather, and in Austin, cold weather means roughly 4 months of mild winter that the rest of the country would classify as a pleasant fall. The shoulder stiffens and aches in a specific and recognizable pattern. I have developed over the years a habit of rolling it slowly when I am holding tension in my upper back. I rolled it 4 times before Greg said what he said at the Christmas dinner. I had been rolling it since I walked through the front door and saw the chart on the dining room credenza. The chart was a PowerPoint slide. Greg had taken a slide from one of his business presentations, the kind with a rising bar graph and a motivational phrase positioned in the caption area, and he had printed it at 11 inches by 14 inches and placed it in a tasteful map frame and positioned it on the credenza in the dining room where it would be visible from the table during Christmas dinner. The slide referenced Q4 results. The caption said something about momentum. My sister Ellen had arranged a small pine cone wreath around the base of the frame, so it would read as festive. I stood in the doorway and looked at that frame slide for approximately 4 seconds, and then I went to find Ellen in the kitchen and I said, "He framed the slide." She said, "He is proud of it." I said, "I know, I meant it. I was not mocking him." People are proud of different things. I have worked alongside people who had their unit patch tattooed on their forearms, which some of them did, and I understood exactly what that meant to them, and I respected it completely. Everyone keeps their pride somewhere. The question is never whether the pride is real. The question is whether the framework you use to rank other people's work has room for work it cannot see. Greg does not have room in his framework for work it cannot see. This is the important thing to understand about Greg, and I want to be precise about it because I have no interest in describing him as a villain. He is not a villain. He is a genuinely kind person who brings exceptional wine to events, who remembers birthdays without prompting, who coaches his daughter's soccer team with real dedication and zero ego, who organized his finances at age 31 with enough foresight that their advisor gets emotional at annual reviews. He is a good husband to my sister in most of the ways that matter for a long, stable marriage. He has built a life of genuine quality and he is justly proud of it. But Greg believes, with the sincere and complete conviction of a man who has never been required to revise it, that every human contribution to the world can be assessed using the same framework he uses to evaluate his team's quarterly performance. He believes this because the framework has never failed him. He has a measurement system. He applies it. It produces numbers. The numbers tell him where things rank: salary, title, reporting structure, head count, scope. These are the variables. Feed them into the formula. Get your answer. He is not arrogant about this. He genuinely believes this is how the world works and that people who resist measurement are either hiding inadequacy or haven't yet understood that measurement is how you improve. He is trying, always, to be helpful within that framework. The framework does not have a row for outcomes measured in people who came home. It does not have a column for work that cannot be named. I have known Greg for 13 years. He married Ellen when I was 35 and he was 33. And from the first dinner we shared, I could see that he was running me through his system. He asked about rank, which was a start. He asked about salary, because salary is a universal unit he can convert into a position on his mental chart. I told him federal pay scale does not translate cleanly into civilian equivalents. He looked briefly frustrated, the way people look when a formula stalls, and moved on. He asked about future plans. I said I was focused on the current assignment. He asked who I reported to. I gave him a name that was accurate. and that provided exactly zero useful context. He nodded as if he had received something. He had not. Over the years that followed, Greg arrived at a description of my career that satisfied his framework and that I never corrected. Correcting it would have required either providing classified context I cannot share, or saying your description is inadequate, which would have started an argument at every holiday gathering for the next decade, or simply lying, which I do not do. The description Greg arrived at was, Rachel is some kind of military analyst. He said it with the air of a man who has done diligent research and reached a reasonable conclusion. He said it at dinner parties when people asked about me. He said it to his colleagues when my sister mentioned I was visiting. He said it, I later learned from Ellen, at their book club, at neighborhood cookouts, at his company's holiday party, when someone asked who the woman in the corner was. Rachel is some kind of military analyst. It's interesting work. She's quite private about it. Not private. The distinction between private and classified is one that civilians collapse because it serves them to collapse it. I am not private. I am bound. There is no version of the word private that captures what it costs to carry classified work across a decade of Christmas dinners and birthday parties and backyard barbecues while the people who love you construct progressively more inaccurate summaries of your life, and you smile and say, something like that. The first time Greg introduced me as some kind of administrative coordinator, I was 36 years old and we were at a rooftop birthday party downtown for Ellen. I had flown in from a location I will not name, and I was flying back the following morning. I was in civilian clothes. I was drinking sparkling water because in those years I was always drinking sparkling water, always holding myself at the edge of possibly needing to be somewhere that required full function. One of Greg's colleagues asked what I did. Before I could answer, Greg said, she does administrative coordination for the military, specialized project management for classified work, kind of like a very high-level coordinator. The colleague said, interesting, and moved on. I looked at Ellen over the rim of my glass. She looked back. Her expression was the one I knew well already, the one that carried apology and helplessness and a sincere request that I not make it a thing at her birthday party. I did not make it a thing. I have never made it a thing. This is not because I lack the capacity. There is a version of me that exists entirely in my own interior that has made it a thing approximately 400 times. That version of me has stood at dinner tables and said, actually, let me tell you what I do. Let me explain what it means to coordinate intelligence support for direct action missions. Let me describe the specific quality of the room you sit in when you are waiting for a confirmation that determines whether people come home. Let me tell you about the 37 hours I was awake during a particular operational window without access to a normal bed, a normal meal, or a normal definition of what comes next. Let me tell you what the word outcomes means in the work I did, and then let me tell you whether the word secretary is accurate. That version of me has never been allowed to speak at a dinner party. There are rules and there are values, and when you have done classified work for long enough, the line between them blurs in a way that is hard to explain. The rule is that you do not discuss classified material with people who do not hold the appropriate clearances. The value is something harder to name. It has to do with understanding that the work was never for recognition. It was never for the moment at the party, the nod across the dinner table, the vindication of having someone finally understand. The work was for what the work was for. The outcomes were real, whether or not anyone at any Christmas dinner understood the nature of the contribution. I believed that. I believe it still. But I am also a person. And persons have shoulders, and sometimes the shoulders ache. Let me tell you about the years between that first birthday party and last Christmas. Let me tell you about the accumulation of it, because it did not happen in one sudden injury. It happened the way most lasting damage happens, in layers, each one individually thin enough to carry, collectively heavy enough to matter. Year 2 of Greg and Ellen's marriage, their first Christmas dinner as homeowners in the new house in Cedar Park. Greg had just been promoted to team lead and was describing his management philosophy at the dinner table with the enthusiasm of a man who has recently been given a title and is exploring all its conceptual edges. He talked about accountability structures and performance frameworks and the way he thought about incentivizing his team. It was a genuine conversation. He had genuine thoughts. I sat across from a retired school teacher named Margaret who asked questions with real curiosity, and the conversation was pleasant. Near the end of the meal, someone asked me how things were going at work. And I said, fine, busy. And Greg said, she's always busy. She keeps the whole JSOC machine running from the back office. Back office. I held the back office in my chest for a moment. The way you hold something that has landed wrong, and then I set my fork down cleanly and picked up my water glass. I said, something like that. Ellen changed the subject. Greg was already talking to someone else. He had not noticed anything at all. Year 4. Thanksgiving. Greg's parents were visiting from Houston, and his father, a retired banker named Charles, was the kind of man who assessed other men and women by their professional titles the way a sommelier assesses wine by its label. He asked everyone at the table what they did for a living. He asked it in the friendly, practiced way of a man who has asked this question 10,000 times and genuinely believes the answer tells him something useful. When he got to me, Greg answered before I could. He said, Rachel works for the Army, intelligence support. She's basically a senior coordinator on the operational side. Charles said, support staff, very important. Rachel, you must be good at keeping things organized. I said, something like that. Ellen passed the sweet potatoes. Charles moved on to the next person. My shoulder, which had been doing reasonably well that November, ached for the rest of the meal. Year 6. A summer cookout at their house, 20 people in the backyard. Greg was describing his new division's structure to a small group near the grill. He had a whiteboard marker and was drawing boxes in the air because Greg is a man who draws boxes in the air when he explains things. He described the layers of management, the reporting structure, the accountability chain, the span of control. Someone from the group asked about me. I could see them glancing in my direction. Greg looked over at me with genuine warmth and said, Rachel is career military, intelligence work. She's a good example of someone who thrived in a very flat structure. Not a lot of room to move up, but good at what she does in the lane she's in. A flat structure. Thrived in a flat structure. I was, at that time, carrying a clearance level that Greg would not be able to apply for, at a position that is not described in flat organizational terms in any document that has ever been produced about it. I drank my sparkling water and watched the smoke rise from the grill and thought about the retirement that was still a decade away and about how many more summer cookouts stood between me and it. Year 8. Ellen's 40th birthday dinner, a nice restaurant downtown, 12 people. Greg gave a toast. It was a genuinely good toast, warm and specific and funny in the right places, and he talked about the people Ellen was surrounded by, each person in turn. When he got to me, he said, Rachel has always been the rock of this family, the steady one. She shows up. She does the work. She does not need credit. This was meant as a compliment. He meant every word of it sincerely, and every word of it was, in its way, accurate. I do show up. I do the work. I do not need credit. But there is a difference between not needing credit and being described in a way that flattens 20 years of a specific and demanding career into the language of the dependable support person. I raised my glass and smiled across the table at my sister, and she looked at me with full knowledge of exactly what the smile cost. The word he used last Christmas was not the worst version he had ever produced. It was not the first version. It was the version that happened to have an audience that included Martin Haley. I want to tell you about the morning of that Christmas before I tell you about Martin Haley's 10 seconds. I woke up at 5:47 in the morning, which is not unusual for me. 26 years of keeping operational hours means my body does not understand the concept of sleeping until 7. I made coffee, very black, in the truck stop mug I have been using for 11 years and intend to continue using for the rest of my foreseeable life. I sat at the kitchen table with the mug and the folder of retirement paperwork that has been sitting on my kitchen table since August because I have not yet decided where it should live permanently, and I thought about whether I wanted to go. I want to be honest with you about this. There was a version of that morning where I called Ellen and said I was under the weather and sent a card and spent Christmas in my truck somewhere quiet. I have done this before, not on Christmas specifically, but I have done the version of this where the accumulation of what a family gathering will require reaches a threshold that makes attendance feel like a professional task rather than a personal pleasure, and I have found a graceful way out. I know how to make it believable. I know how to time the call so that Ellen is already in the middle of the preparation and cannot talk long and will accept the explanation and let me go with love and without too much analysis. I did not call. I finished the coffee. I showered. I put on a gray sweater that I like and dark jeans and the boots I bought 3 years ago that are the best purchase I have made in my civilian life. I drove the 40 minutes to Cedar Park in the truck with the radio on a station that plays music from a long time ago, and I sang along to 2 songs and did not sing along to the others. And I pulled into Ellen's driveway and I sat there. 7 minutes? I always sit in cars before I go in. I know I do this. I know it is a form of preparation that is probably also a form of delay. In those 7 minutes, I did what I always do, which is run a quiet inventory of what the next 2 hours will contain and what it will require of me, what I will be asked to be, what I will be required to not say, where the exits are, and who my anchor in the room will be, and how many times I can reasonably visit the kitchen for a glass of water before it becomes an obvious coping mechanism rather than a casual thing. I thought about Greg. I thought about the specific flavor of helpfulness he brings to social gatherings, the way he positions himself as the person who explains and connects and contextualizes. I thought about the fact that my shoulder had been bothering me since Wednesday. I thought about the fact that I had not had a relationship in 8 months and that Ellen was going to ask about it in a quiet moment near the kitchen sink and I was going to say I was fine, which I was, mostly. And she was going to look at me in the specific way she looks at me when she believes me and also does not quite believe me simultaneously. 7 minutes. I got out of the truck. I went inside. Ellen was wearing a green dress she had bought the previous Monday and texted me a picture of on Tuesday asking if it was too festive. I had told her to wear the green one. She looked genuinely beautiful in it and slightly frantic in the way she always looks when she is hosting a large gathering. Moving between kitchen and dining room and front door in a choreography she had designed completely and would deny was designed at all. When she saw me, she stopped moving. She crossed the room and gave me the real hug. Not the host hug, the actual one. The hug that means, I am glad you are here, and I know this requires something from you sometimes, and I appreciate it, and I am not going to say all of that because we both already know it. I said, you look beautiful. She said, the roles are not going to work. I said, the roles always work. She said, not this year. She was right. The roles were slightly too dense. Nobody commented on them because nobody wanted to be the person who complained about the roles at Christmas dinner in someone else's home. Greg came in from the living room and greeted me with both hands. The way he always greets me, genuinely warm in the way of a man who has consciously decided to be good at family relationships and who executes on that decision reliably. He said, Rachel, good. You made it. He asked about the drive. I told him the drive was fine. He said, good, good. And his eyes were already moving toward the door because the next guests were arriving and Greg is always thinking 2 steps ahead at his own events. He was wearing a sweater his wife had bought him. It was a good sweater. It fit him well. He looked like a man who had succeeded at the things he set out to succeed at, wearing the evidence of that success comfortably, without anxiety. I did not begrudge him any of it. I never have. The guests arrived. Ellen's book club friends, 2 couples with easy conversation and genuine warmth toward each other. Greg's colleague Paul, who had been at the previous Christmas and who had asked me then about my background and accepted my general answer graciously. Greg's colleague Sandra, who worked in the same division and had a dry, compact humor that I found genuinely funny. A retired federal judge named Helen, who was Ellen's former neighbor and who had been coming to this Christmas dinner for 6 years and who said very little but listened to everything with the kind of complete attention that only certain professionals develop, the ones whose job has required them to hold other people's words in memory without distortion for very long periods. And Martin Haley, who I did not know. Martin came through the door last, or nearly last, and he did the thing I recognize when I see it, which is that he paused inside the entryway and took a full inventory of the room before committing to a direction. He was 62 years old, though I did not know that at the time. He was trim and careful in the way of a man who respects his body, not because he is vain, but because he understands that the body is a professional tool and maintaining it is part of maintaining his effectiveness. He had a quality of stillness that I know from my work, not the stillness of disengagement, the stillness of a person who has learned to say nothing until they are certain of what they know. He made eye contact with me across the room. I made eye contact back. This lasted approximately 1.5 seconds and contained the specific quality of mutual professional recognition that does not require words. We both understood, in those 1.5 seconds, that we were people who had worked in adjacent or related spaces. Not the same space, not necessarily the same world, but close enough that the recognition was real. We nodded at each other. We moved toward the drinks table. We made small talk of the kind that is not the point. He asked me what I did. I gave him the short version that I give civilians. He asked a follow-up question that was more specific than civilians usually ask, and the specificity of the question told me something about the shape of his experience. I gave him a slightly longer version. He nodded. He said, "Good work." He said it with the quiet weight of someone who means something more than the words carry. And then he moved toward the other side of the room, and I thought, this man has been in this neighborhood. I did not know yet how close dinner was served. Ellen had made her traditional menu, which has been the same since she and Greg got married, a menu built from family recipes and adjusted each year by exactly one experimental side dish that sometimes works and sometimes does not. This year, the experimental dish was a roasted fennel preparation that divided the table quietly. Some people enthusiastic and some people trying to be polite about fennel. The rolls, as established, were slightly too dense, but structurally fine. The ham was excellent. Ellen had been working on her ham for 10 years and it showed. Greg, as he always does at his own table, facilitated the conversation the way a moderately skilled conference host facilitates a panel discussion, drawing people out in turns, building on what each person said, steering away from dead ends, keeping energy moving. He is genuinely good at this. He likes it. It is one of the places where his gift for thinking in systems serves the actual human beings in the room, rather than abstracting them into data points. He told the story of the Q4 contract renewal. He told it with genuine craft. 8 months, the legal team resistance, the pivot in month 6 that changed the client's posture. He described the stakeholder dynamics with precision. Paul asked a good question. Sandra made a specific and accurate observation about the challenge of late-stage negotiation with risk-averse clients. The table was engaged. Greg was in his element. I was glad for him. I ate 2 bites of ham and watched my sister watching her husband glow, and I felt genuine warmth toward both of them. The conversation turned toward the new year, plans, intentions, the particular mood of late December when everything still feels possible because the accounting has not yet come due. Helen said she intended to do less and do it better. I thought this was the most intelligent thing said at the table all evening. Paul described a home renovation. Sandra described a sabbatical approval she had just received. And then Greg turned to me with the easy warmth of a good host and said, "Rachel, what is ahead for you in the new year?" I said, "I am in a transition year. I am sorting out some next steps." I had retired from active service 8 months prior. The retirement had been quiet, which was my request. There had been a small ceremony with people whose names I will not put in this account, in a room I will not describe, in a building that does not have a name I am free to use. There had been paperwork and a very good meal at a Vietnamese restaurant in a city I won't name, with 3 people who knew the full shape of my career and who said, over the course of that meal, everything that needed to be said without saying anything that would survive a classification review. I drove home alone, which felt exactly right. I sat in the truck in front of my house for 11 minutes, which is 4 minutes longer than my usual pre-entry sit, and I thought about what it means to stop doing the work that organized your sense of self for 26 years. I did not cry. I rolled my shoulder 4 times and went inside. Greg heard the words transition year and pivoted immediately into connector mode. He said, "Paul, Rachel's background is government and national security. Your company does a lot of that contracting." Paul said, "Absolutely, we should talk." I said, "Thank you, I would appreciate that." And then Greg, in the clean and helpful motion of a man facilitating a professional introduction, turned to Paul and said, "She has been doing intelligence work, mostly the support and administrative side, coordination and project management for the special operations community, high level, but primarily in the enabling function. Think of it like a senior executive assistant for the classified world." I looked at my plate. Senior executive assistant, 13 years of these descriptions, and they had always been wrong in the same way. the way a map is wrong when it has the general shape of the territory but is missing everything below the surface. He was not lying. He was doing what he always did, which was taking the limited information available to him and producing the most plausible explanation his framework could support. The problem was that his framework ended at the waterline. What he was describing as the executive assistant was the portion of the iceberg visible from the surface. The rest of it, the weight of it, the size of it, was somewhere that his measurement system had no instruments for. Paul nodded and said my background sounded valuable across several of their divisions. He named a few. He was being genuine and kind. I said I would love to learn more. I refilled the water glass of the person to my right because the pitcher was near me. The moment that preceded Greg's final word had a shape I noticed in real time. Paul had asked a clarifying question about the kind of work I had done, something about whether it was primarily analytical or primarily operational in nature, and Greg had been answering on my behalf because Greg was in the flow of explaining, and the question had been addressed to him rather than to me, and in the dynamic of that table, Greg was the one doing the explaining. My role in the structure he had built for the last 2 minutes was to be the subject of the explanation. He was not doing this maliciously. He was doing it with the smooth confidence of a man who has always understood things well enough to explain them. He said, "The thing about Rachel's career is that it has always been more operational than strategic, more coordinator than commander. You know, if you put her on a corporate org chart, she would sit comfortably in a senior middle management position. Very effective in that lane, very skilled at the enabling function. She is excellent middle management." He smiled at me when he said it. I said something like that. I picked up the gravy. I passed it to my left. My shoulder ached in the specific pattern I know, the cold weather ache that has lived in that joint since the repair. I rolled it once, slowly, under the table where it would not be visible. I looked at the framed Q4 results slide on the credenza, the pine cone wreath around its base. I thought about a particular night in a particular location in the 3rd year of my assignment, a night when I had been awake for 29 hours and the information I was working with had required a decision whose consequences I would not know for 6 more hours. And when the confirmation finally came, it arrived in 3 words that I cannot repeat, and it meant that what I had done had held. I thought about the weight of those 3 words. I thought about the specific quiet of the room after they came through. I thought about what the word coordinator means if you apply it to that room. Ellen was watching me from across the table. She had the expression, I know, the one that carries apology inside it, the one that is also helpless, because she is a woman who has chosen a long life with a man whose framework she married along with the rest of him, and who does not have a clean way to revise the framework from inside the marriage without doing damage that would cost more than it fixes. She looked at me. I looked back. I gave her the look that means it is fine and let it go. She gave me the look that means I know and I am sorry. 13 years of those looks across dinner tables. Helen, the retired federal judge, was looking at me over the rim of her water glass with the full weight of a person who has spent a career listening to people tell partial truths and partial lies and has developed a fine instrument for the difference. She and I made eye contact for half a second. She gave me a nod so small that no one else at the table would have read it as a nod. It said, I see you. It said, I know. It said, this is not where that conversation happens. I nodded back, equally small. We both returned to our plates. Martin Haley put down his fork. I noticed it in my peripheral attention, the way I notice things in peripheral attention, which is to say completely and instantly, but without directing visible focus toward it. The deliberate sound of silverware placed carefully on ceramic in a room full of the ambient sounds of a dinner in progress has a specific quality. 4 people at that table noticed it. I was one of them. Martin said, I missed something. He said it mildly, in the tone of a man asking for information he wants, not staging a confrontation. He said, Greg, I want to make sure I understood. Which organization specifically is Rachel attached to? He directed the question to Greg. Greg waved a hand with the easy confidence of a man who does not register the specific quality of the question. He named the general category. He gestured in my direction. Martin looked at me. He said, specifically, and I said it. I said the name. I say it rarely in social settings because it changes the quality of the air in the room in ways that complicate the remainder of the evening. But Martin had asked in a tone I recognized as professional curiosity and not civilian nosiness. And the question had been direct and specific, and I am a person who answers direct and specific questions directly and specifically. I said it. Martin looked at his fork on the edge of his plate for one full second. Then he looked at Greg. He said, I want to tell you something. He said it without heat, without volume, without any of the performance that people use when they want to win a room. He said it with the authority of complete certainty, which is a different thing entirely. He said, I spent 31 years in national security law. I worked with the Senate Armed Services Committee on 3 separate occasions across my career. I have reviewed materials pertaining to several of the organizations in that community. He paused. He said, the people at Rachel's level in that community, he paused again, are not described as middle management in any document I have ever read. He said it looking at Greg. Then he turned to me. He said, I apologize for asking a question you would rather I had not asked. Thank you for what you have done does not say it right, but thank you for what you have done. I said, thank you. Martin picked up his fork. 4 seconds of quiet. I want to tell you what those 4 seconds were. I have been in briefing rooms when information arrives that reorganizes the picture and every person in the room feels the reorganization happening simultaneously and nobody speaks while it completes because there is nothing to say during the completion. I have been in operation centers when a confirmation comes through and the quality of the air changes before anyone opens their mouth. I have been in hallways, outside rooms where decisions were being made and the waiting had a specific texture to it, a texture that lives in the body rather than in the mind. The 4 seconds after Martin spoke had a texture I knew. It was the texture of something being corrected that had been wrong for a very long time. Not loudly, not with triumph, just corrected. Set right by someone who had the standing to do it and the restraint to do it in 10 words rather than 10 minutes. And I want to tell you what I felt, because I had assumed in the occasional moments over 13 years when I had imagined something like this, that what I would feel was vindication, a specific sweetness, the satisfaction of having been proven right in front of the right person. But what I felt in those 4 seconds was not sweet. It was not triumphant. It was more like relief. It was more like the feeling you get when you have been carrying something at the edge of your capacity for a very long time, and you have been managing the weight so carefully that you stopped noticing what managing it cost, and then, for 4 seconds, the weight redistributes, and in the redistribution, you finally feel the shape of what you have been carrying and how long you have been carrying it. 13 years. That is how long it had been. Ellen said something about the rolls. Paul reached for the butter. Sandra asked Greg a follow-up question about the Q4 contract that gave him a gracious exit from the 4-second quiet, which I believe Sandra may have intended as a kindness and which I appreciated. The dinner noise reassembled itself around us the way dinner noise does when it has been briefly interrupted and the table has collectively decided that the interruption is complete. Greg did not speak again for a while. He was not sullen. He was not hostile. He was the quiet of a man who has had a piece of information revised in public and is processing the revision, running it through his framework, trying to find where it lands. I have sat in rooms full of that particular quiet. It is not a bad quiet. It is the quiet of recalibration. It takes time. I did not look at him in a way that would accelerate or complicate it. I let it be. Helen refilled her own water glass and reached over and refilled mine. She did it without looking at me directly and without saying anything, and it was one of the most precise acts of solidarity I received that evening. Martin and I did not speak to each other again directly during dinner, but at some point in the last 30 minutes of the meal, across the table and through the ambient conversation, we had an exchange of looks that contained a full conversation. He acknowledged that he had said something that needed to be said. I acknowledged that I would not have said it myself. He acknowledged that he knew that about the work and the people who do it. I acknowledged that I was glad someone who had the standing to say it had said it anyway. All of this happened in approximately 3 seconds, without words, and is probably the most efficiently conducted conversation I participated in that entire year. After dinner, when the plates were being collected and people were moving between the dining room and the living room, Greg came to stand near the window that looks out to the backyard. He stood beside me. He said, "I did not realize." I said, "I know." He said, "I was just trying to give Paul a picture of the work." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I should have asked, instead of assuming." I said, "Probably." He said, "You never said anything." I said, "There was nothing I could have said that would have helped." He looked out at the backyard, his daughter's soccer goal still standing at the far end of the lawn. He said, "For what it's worth." He stopped. He started again. He said, "I am glad you did what you did. Do what you did, whatever the tense is." I said, "Was, past tense." He nodded. He said, "I'm glad." He went back to collect plates, and I remained at the window for one more moment, looking at the soccer goal, and then I followed him. Ellen found me in the kitchen 15 minutes later. She handed me a dish towel without asking if I wanted one, and began washing the good wine glasses, the ones she does not put in the dishwasher. I stood beside her and dried. She said, "Martin used to do some Department of Defense work before he retired." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "I could tell by the way he heard the name." She washed a glass and handed it over and said, "Has Greg been saying those kinds of things for a long time?" I said, 13 years, more or less. She stopped washing. She turned and looked at me. She said, "Rachel." I said, "It is fine, Ellen." She said, "It is not fine." I said, "It is not fine, but it is also not worth 13 years of Christmas dinners turning into something else." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I should have said something." I said, "What would you have said?" She did not answer. I dried the glass. I set it in the cabinet on the third shelf from the bottom, the one with the rubber non-slip liner. I said, "There is nothing to say. It is not that what he said was mean. It was wrong because he did not have the information, and he cannot have the information. So the gap stays. You can be angry at the gap, but you cannot close it." She handed me another glass. She said, "Still?" I said, "Still?" And we washed the rest of the glasses, and we talked about her book club's January selection, and about her daughter's new interest in marine biology, and about the way the green dress had turned out to be the right choice, which it had, and we did not talk about the dinner again. I drove home in the truck. 40 minutes on a Sunday evening with light traffic and the radio on the old music station. I sang along to 2 songs. I did not sing along to 3. I thought about nothing in particular for most of the drive, which is a skill I developed deliberately in my late 30s when I understood that the ability to think about nothing in particular for sustained periods is not something the human brain comes with by default, and that building it takes work. I consider it one of my genuine professional achievements. Not the classified ones, the personal one, the quiet one. I parked in front of my house. I sat in the truck for 3 minutes. That is the shortest I have sat in that truck in front of that house before going in for as long as I can remember. Usually it is 7, sometimes more. 3 minutes is a number that means something shifted. I went inside. I had a glass of water. I looked at the retirement folder on the kitchen table. It is a standard manila folder containing my DD 214, my separation orders, my citations, which are a small stack of documents that say things I will not reproduce here. I have been meaning to put this folder somewhere it belongs: a filing cabinet, a box marked important documents, some designated place that is not my kitchen table. I have not done this. I think I have not done this because the folder on the kitchen table is a version of the work still being present in the room, and I am not yet fully prepared for the version of the room without it. I will get there. I am not rushing it. I thought about what comes next. I do not know yet in specific terms. There are options available to me that were not available when I was active. Ways of using what I know in contexts where the rules of classification are somewhat different. There are people who have called. I am thinking. I am not rushing the thinking either. I have sat with uncertain next chapters before. They resolve when they are ready to resolve. What I know is this. I drove to Christmas dinner alone. I sat in a truck for 7 minutes before I went in. I ate Christmas dinner with 14 people in Austin, Texas, 12 of whom I like, and one of whom has been constructing an inaccurate account of my career for 13 years out of genuine, helpless goodwill and the limitations of a measurement system that was not built for work like mine. I was seen in that room for 10 seconds by a man who held the knowledge and the standing to see me accurately and the character to say what he saw without making it into a performance. It was 10 seconds out of 13 years of Christmas dinners. It was enough. There is something I want to say about the people who do this work. Not just me. The people I worked alongside over 26 years, most of whom I cannot name and whose contributions I am not free to describe. There is a thing that gets said about people in classified work, which is that they do not need recognition, as if this were a natural trait we were born with, a constitutional tolerance for invisibility that others simply lack. I want to push back on that gently, because it is not quite right. We are not built differently from other people in this way. We feel the weight of invisible contribution the same way anyone feels it. The shoulder aches whether or not the person in the room knows what caused it. The 7 minutes in the truck happen whether or not the dinner table ever understands what the truck carries. But we chose the work, knowing what it was. We chose it, knowing that the recognition structure is internal, that the accountability runs in directions that are not visible from the outside, that the people who fully understand what we did may number in the single digits and cannot say so in any room that matters socially. We chose it because the work needed doing, and because we were good at it, and because something in the early years felt like a calling. The specific clarity of purpose that comes from understanding that what you do has direct and verifiable consequences for real people, and that the consequences are real whether or not anyone can see them. I chose this at 22 years old. I would choose it again. Not because it was easy or because the weight was manageable or because 13 years of Christmas dinners did not accumulate into something I carried in my shoulder on cold days. I would choose it again because the outcomes were real, because the people who came home, because the work that cannot be described produced results that cannot be named, and the results were not diminished by the absence of a name. But I stood in my sister's kitchen, drying the good wine glasses, and I was aware of something I had not let myself name before. The weight. The specific, patient, unglamorous weight of being described incorrectly by someone who loves you repeatedly over years, not with malice, but with the sincere confidence of a person whose framework is simply inadequate to the task. That weight is real. It does not diminish the work. It does not unmake the decisions or change the outcomes or alter the quality of what happened in the rooms I was in. But it is a weight that a person carries, and it is heavier than I had admitted to myself. And standing at that sink with a dish towel in my hand, I finally let myself feel how heavy it had been. And then I thought about Martin Haley putting down his fork. And the weight redistributed, not went away, redistributed. There is a difference. The work is still the work. The classification is still the classification. Greg still has his framework and his Q4 results slide and his genuine belief that he understands the shape of my career. None of that changed in 10 seconds. But the weight of carrying it changed. The distribution changed. And distribution matters when you are talking about how far a person can carry something. There's a woman I worked with in the middle years of my assignment, closer to the end of her career than the beginning, who had a way of saying things with exactly the number of words the situation required and not one more. Near the end of a particularly difficult operational period in a location I will not name, she said something that I have carried since. She said, "The results do not need an audience. The audience needs the results." Those are not the same thing. I have held that sentence through every Christmas dinner since I heard it, through every administrative coordinator and high-level secretary and middle management and support function, through every moment when the work was being reduced to a label that did not fit it by people who did not have the information to fit it correctly. The results were real. The protection was complete or it was not. And when it was complete, regardless of who understood the nature of the contribution. The audience does not generate the result. The result exists independent of the audience. That is not a consolation, it is a fact. But Martin Haley put down his fork, and for 10 seconds, something that had been wrong for 13 years was corrected, quietly, in front of witnesses, by someone who had the standing to correct it. And I was in the room. I was present for the correction. And the fact of the correction did not change the results, which were already in the past and already real and already permanent, but it changed something else. Something that lives in the shoulder on cold days. Something that explains 7 minutes in the truck. Something that has to do with being a person who carries a very specific kind of invisible work through a life full of people who love her and cannot see what she has been carrying. The results do not need an audience. That is true. But the person who produced the results is still a person. And persons, now and then, need to be seen, not for the results, not as validation, not as proof that the work mattered because it mattered already, but simply as the acknowledgement that what they carried was real and that the weight of it was real and that the person who carried it is real. That is a different thing from recognition. It is a smaller thing. It is also sometimes the thing that makes it possible to keep going. I drove home in the truck. I sat in front of my house for 3 minutes. I went inside. I had a glass of water. I looked at the folder on the kitchen table. I thought about what comes next. I went to bed. My shoulder did not ache that night. It aches again now, some mornings, the way it always has and probably always will. But that night, it did not ache. And I laid in the dark and I thought about 10 seconds at a Christmas dinner table and about a man who put down his fork with deliberate care and said a true thing quietly. And I thought about what it means to have been seen, even briefly, even once, by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. My name is Rachel Davis. I am 48 years old. I did work I cannot fully describe for 26 years. The work mattered in ways that cannot be publicly verified and that I cannot explain to anyone I love. The work was real. The outcomes were real. The people who came home, came home. And the person who helped make that possible is still a person. And persons, even the ones who chose the invisible work, even the ones who knew going in that the recognition structure ran in silent directions, even the ones who would choose it all again without hesitation, are not entirely separate from the question of whether anyone in the room can see them clearly. Not for the work. The work does not need it. The work is already done. For the person still needs it, even once, even briefly, even 10 seconds at a Christmas dinner table with 14 people and a framed Q4 results slide on the credenza and rolls that did not quite work. Being seen is not the point, but it is not nothing. And sometimes, not nothing is exactly enough.